And Chloe, if you, I guess, want to introduce yourself and get started, and then as people join, we can kind of fill them in.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, first of all, to Craft Chatham and Cassandra for putting all of this together, the grain boxes. And oh, I just saw a note that said your internet connection is unstable. So I said I had bad luck. We'll see.
We'll see what
Yeah, I have my phone nearby, so if I cut out, Cassandra, just give me a call.
Okay.
But my name's Chloe. I am the owner, founder, and solo baker behind the sourdough bakery CrustWorthy. It's a Pittsburgh-based business. I've been doing it for about 2 years now, and a half. It feels like longer. It's been going for a while, but officially a year and a half. I don't have a storefront right now. I'm just working and producing for farmers markets. I'm at the Bloomfield Market on Saturdays, the Squirrel Hill Market every other Sunday, and the Lawrenceville Market every other Tuesday. So if you're interested to try out CrustWorthy products, we do bread, pastries, other kinds of goodies. Obviously, we have the croutons in there. You can find us there on our website. We also list where we're at when, we have a nice little calendar on there because it can get a little confusing between the alternating markets. Other than that, I'm not really servicing anywhere else right now. It's just a really crazy time to be working into any of that kind of stuff. But through the winter, hoping to have something in place like a bread share or maybe doing some winter markets. So you can always just follow along online or with social media to figure out where to get CrustWorthy bread. So yeah, this is my first virtual workshop with Chatham. Really excited to have you all here. We're going to be reviewing how to use your dehydrated sourdough starter today. So basically what you've gotten in your box is just flour and some starter that's been dehydrated to a shelf-stable state. This will last for presumably many months. If you're feeling like sourdough is not really in the mix for you right now, that's totally fine. You can even put it in your fridge or freezer to help prolong its stay, but as long as you keep it dry and the top sealed on your little container, it should be fine. We'll also include instructions. I think Cassandra and I were talking about sending out some resources for you after this workshop so that you can reference it if you decide you want to start your own starter from scratch. The process is really quite similar. This will just give you a little kickstart so that you can get your baking going sooner. So the first thing you'll want to do is figure out what kind of a container you want to keep your starter in, because this is very convenient for packaging the dehydrated starter, but it's a little small. So I would recommend using a container that is clear. The ball canning jars work great, something that's like this size. You can use one that's bigger. You can even go smaller if you want, if you're only going to be doing really small batches of bread. But I like this because I can stick my hand in it and feel around, get to know the starter, what it feels like. I can get utensils in pretty easily. Something that has a thinner top, you'll realize pretty quickly can be difficult to clean out and to get starter out of it. So I'd recommend something that has a wide mouth if you can. You can also use a plastic container. Plastic clear containers work fine as long as they're clean. They don't have any scents or anything weird stuck in them. I love those takeout containers you get, like if you get something with soup in it, or they look like this. And I'm actually keeping some starter in here right now, so you can see that it works out pretty well. It's good to choose a container where you're going to have enough room for the rise. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but that's why we're choosing these kinds of containers and that kind of size. So once you have your container figured out, you'll also want a way to cover it up, just because you want to keep out dirt, you want to keep out bugs, kids, dogs, pets, whatever. But you also want to allow it to breathe. So you don't want anything super tight sealed. I like to use the lid without the rim for mason jars. It sits really nicely on top of there, but the gases that are produced through the sourdough starter process are still able to come out. It just seems to work really well. You can also, if you don't prefer that, or you just want to try something different, you can use a cloth. If you have a different kind of, different kind of container, you can use that with a rubber band. That'll keep the cloth on top, just like so. It gets a nice little hat. It's also kind of festive. And so the last thing that you might want to consider for your container, if you want to monitor the progress of your rise and fall of the starter, because it's going to be going through these cycles where it grows and then it shrinks as the starter is active and then starts to sort of bubble back down. You can use a rubber band around your container. Actually, let me put it on the other one where I already have some starter going. So say I had just fed my starter. If I put my rubber band on here right now, I'll be able to see whenever it rises and falls back down, monitoring it throughout the day or the next morning, or however I'm timing it out. So those are just things to think about and things to collect. So I'm going to use this today. Something that's helpful if you're going to be using your sourdough starter for baking bread and you really want to start learning how to use recipes for sourdough bread, is a digital scale. They're pretty cheap if you want to get one online or in a Target or something like that, cooking store. You don't need anything super fancy. Really, all it has to do is to tell you what the starter weighs, or your container, whatever that you're measuring in grams. That's the measurement that you'll find that's most common in most sourdough recipes. It's just a really convenient way to measure out ingredients. You can use, standard cups, measuring cups, and measuring spoons, but that'll only get you so far. So I just recommend making this investment from the beginning, or if you already have one, you're a step ahead of the game. So the first thing I'll do with my scale is turn it on, and there's usually a button that also says tare, T-A-R-E. What that button does is it just brings the scale to 0. If you have anything on the scale, it'll bring back down the measurement to 0 so that you can start adding again. So I am just checking my scale to make sure that it says 0. And if it's not, I'll hit the tare button while it's on the table. Stable, flat, we want that. So it's at 0 grams, double checking that I'm in the right unit. And I'm gonna put my container on just to see what my container weighs. So this jar happens to be 285 grams. It's a great idea to write this down somewhere or to make a note of it. You can write it on a piece of tape and put that onto your container, just so that in the future, whenever you're trying to figure out how much starter you actually have that's usable in here, you'll already know what your container weighs, and you'll be able to use some simple math to find out how much starter you have. So starting out at 285 grams with my container, but now I'm going to press the tare button, which then brings us back to 0 while my jar is still on, on the scale. I don't know if I can show that. Now it's time to take your starter and you can pour it into your jar. So it turns out I have about 7 grams of starter. It's going to be variable for everyone. This part isn't really important. It's just fun. So it's time again to press tare. Now I have my jar and my starter on the scale, and when it's on there, it says 0. So now that we're at our starting point. The first step of rehydrating your starter is to literally rehydrate it. This is where we want to start taking close measure of how much we're putting in. So I would recommend starting out with about 100 grams of water. That should be enough for the amount of starter that you have in your box. So I'm adding in 100 grams. And it's okay if you're like 1 or 2 over or under, but you do want it to be as close as possible. All right, so I'm at 101. Now you can see it starts to like cloud up a little bit already, but it's not going to be able to soften for a little bit of time. When I tested this out earlier with this batch of dehydrated starter, I found that it took a couple of hours, and that was after I had broken up the starter a little bit. You could also leave it overnight and it would become completely soft. once it's totally softened, you'll want to take some kind of, you can take your fingers or you can take a spoon or a knife and just really stir it up and get that starter dissolved. So it might be easiest. Oh yeah, thank you. Questions in the chat are starting to come in. So I'll try to answer those as much as I can if I see that it's relevant. Otherwise, I'll wait till the end to address it. But I'm just using room temperature water. I wouldn't use anything too hot or too cold. Too hot and it could kill the good bacteria and yeast that we have in there. And I mean, cold is fine, but generally when you're going to be reviving your starter, you're going to want to use around room temperature. Too cold of a temperature moving forward, and your starter will be really, really slow to get going. So yeah, just room temperature water from the tap is fine. As long as you know that you don't have a lead problem or something in your water that you wouldn't want to be drinking yourself. Filtered water is fine too if you really prefer to use that. But just room temperature water from the tap is what we're using today. So I would recommend just letting this sit overnight. Don't worry about it. You can cover it or not. At this point, it's not too much to worry about. So in the morning, once that is dissolved and it's just down into like fine little pieces, you'll want to add in the equal amount of flour to the amount of water that you had added. So since we added 100 grams of water, we're going to add 100 grams of flour. The kind of flour that we're using in the dehydrated starter is all whole wheat. I know a lot of people are really interested in using whole grains at this point, and we got all these really fun whole grain flours in our boxes, so you can feel free to use one of those if you'd like. You can use the red fife if you want, or I'm sorry, struggling to remember what else is in there. Maybe not the buckwheat. That's the only one I wouldn't recommend at this point because buckwheat flour is a non-gluten containing flour. It'll react very differently to wheat flours if you want to use it for starter. If you're interested in making a gluten-free flour, gluten-free starter, I include it, but it's going to be a completely different animal. So you can do some research online and feel free to email me or contact me somehow if you have questions about it, but it's a whole different world. So for now, I would stick to some kind of wheat flour for your starter to get started and to just kind of get a feel for it. So we're starting out with whole grain starter. You can add all-purpose flour, bread flour, like white bread flour, whole wheat flour. If you're able to, I would recommend to use the unbleached, unbromated flour. You can get this from Frankfurt Farms if you'd like, or the East End Co-op has it. Usually health food stores have it available. You just want to keep as much unnecessary stuff out of there as possible and make sure that you have flour that your yeast is going to want to eat. So after you add your water and dissolve the starter overnight and you add your flour, make sure to mix it up really well. You don't want to get little pockets of flour in there. You want to make sure that all of it gets really hydrated, making sure that you have a good environment for your yeast and bacteria to come back to life. After that first feeding, you'll just let your starter sit, covered but loose, as we talked about. Where you put it doesn't matter so much as long as it's just somewhere safe. Leave it somewhere on your countertop or on top of your fridge. Just let it go. The second day, you're going to want to actually take some of the mixture out. You'll want to take about 75% of it out. In this case, that would be, let's see, if we added 100 grams of 100 grams of water, 100 grams of flour. So we'll take out about 150 grams of the mixture, the total mixture. What do you do with that? Well, that's called sourdough discard. Usually when you have an active starter, that amount that you're taking is active and bubbly and you can use it. You can use it in a recipe, But if you're not going to use it in a recipe and you're only trying to build up the strength of your starter by giving it regular feedings, you know, some people really just throw it away. They, you know, toss it into their compost pile. But you can also save it. It's just flour and water with some healthy microbes in there. So you can toss it into a container and keep it in your fridge for later use. It'll keep in there for a good amount of time. You can, you know, every time that you take out sourdough discard, just put it in that same container until you have enough that you're ready to use. And we'll talk more about, you know, recipes and stuff for that. But for the time being, yeah, just take 150 grams out that second day after you've left the flour and water mixture overnight, and put it somewhere or compost it, deal with it. And now you're ready for the second feeding. You're going to do the same thing that you had done the first time, right? You're going to take your container with the small amount of mixture left in there, put it on your scale, hit the tare button so that it's set to 0, and then you're going to add in again 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. Mix it all up, get it really nice and mixed so that everything's just homogeneous, and you'll want to let it sit again for another day. Now on day 2, you should see some activity in there. Usually it takes more like 4 or 5 days, even more than that sometimes, depending on the kind of flour you're using, for you to get an active starter. But at that point, your starter should start to look pretty bubbly and have a really nice smell. It shouldn't smell too vinegary. It should smell kind of like a fresh, yeasty, almost cheesy smell. Depending on the kind of flour, again, that you have, that'll affect the way that it smells and the way that it feels. But I would just recommend taking this time to kind of get to know what these signs look like, you know, like what the smells are, what the consistency is, because then in the future, if you're trying to problem solve something, you'll be able to better know like what to look for, what makes a healthy starter. So at this point, you're starting to get some bubbles. I realize it's probably going to be kind of hard to show on here. Yeah, that's not showing up at all. But it's not going to be anything like crazy holes to start out. But as you start to regularly feed and monitor it, you'll see that it rises and falls, you know, as it builds up these gases, as it eats away at that starch and produces carbon dioxide. You'll start to understand the activity of it. By day 3 of the same kind of feeding schedule, you should be able to use it to get some pretty solid bread, which is a really nice start. As I said before, usually, you know, it takes about a week of regulated feedings to get a starter that's somewhere near healthy. And even at that point, you know, sometimes the flavor isn't quite there. There's something wrong. But that's all. And if you'll excuse me for 1 minute, there's something going on my stove. I gotta turn the water down. Really sorry. Sorry about that. That's embarrassing. It was at like the lowest simmer, and then it suddenly just decided to go over. But that's the basics of rehydrating your starter. So it gives you a jump start. You know, it's not like you're going to rehydrate it and be able to use it that day, but it does give you a good little leg up.
Chloe, if you were, oh, and I'm Cassandra, by the way, for those of you that joined a little bit later. I'm a program manager at Craft at Chatham University. Chloe, what would you recommend? Like, would you say 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water is like a recommended daily feeding? Or, you know, if you're like, how would those measurements change, I guess, depending on how much you want to use it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks. So it partly depends on, yeah, how much you're planning on making and how often you're going to be baking. If you can get away with feeding it smaller amounts, you are welcome to do that. You know, some people only keep their starter alive by feeding it 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water, or even less than that. Um, the idea is to always leave behind a little bit of that starter mixture whenever you do your next feeding. So that is going to be the seed for your big active starter, and the flour and water is just what you're giving it as food. Um, so to whenever you're moving forward with feedings, it doesn't have to be 100 and 100 every single time. Um, Likely you'll be following some kind of a recipe. Sometimes they even include in it, you know, how much starter you'll start out with, and they'll include the feeding amount. So it'll tell you, you know, the day before you start this recipe, feed your starter this amount of flour and this amount of water. Um, Sometimes it doesn't tell you that, and you have to figure it out yourself, thinking, you know, okay, I have 200 grams of starter already, and I want to make a lot of bread. I need 1,000 grams of starter. So, you know, what's the math of that? The main idea, you know, is to have that little bit of starter, and you also don't want to necessarily exceed the amount of small starter that you have. Excuse me, you don't want to measure under the amount of starter you have with flour and water. So the ratio you're looking for is at least a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio. That means if you have 25 grams of starter, you'll want to add at least 25 grams of flour and 25 grams of water. Or you could add 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. Or you could add 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. But generally, you'll want to keep that same ratio of flour to water as long as it's more than the starter. If you go under that, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's just not exactly the healthiest thing for the starter. You know, it's kind of like how if someone didn't have enough to eat that day, they're not going to perform as well. Um, there are some other ways that you can keep your starter. You know, if you go down the rabbit hole of sourdough, you'll find that it doesn't have to always be equal flour and water ratios, but just to start out, it's the easiest thing to remember to just keep it even. Um, yeah, I would just start looking at some recipes and kind of figuring out from there how much starter you want to keep on hand. For long-term storage, you can also actually refrigerate your starter. That way you don't have to feed it every day for the next day of your life. You can feed your starter as you regularly would, and then put it directly into the fridge, lightly covered as it always would be on the counter. And that'll give it a good solid week of being a healthy, well-fed starter. It doesn't stop the fermentation, but it does slow it down significantly. The bacteria that are in the healthy culture of starter will still be working. So it might be a little bit more acidic than usual, you know, if you go straight into using it again right out of the fridge. But it's a great way to prolong the starter between uses, keeping it nice and active and healthy. And whenever you do take it out of the fridge, I recommend just doing what's called refreshing it, which is just feeding it the same way that we always do, you know, taking some out, having some sourdough discard, putting that away or using it somehow, and then giving it a fresh new feeding before you bake so that it's really good and active and healthy again.
Chloe, I have another question. If you were to start feeding your sourdough with, let's say, the red fife from the grain box, would you want to continue feeding it with that same flour, or could you switch to, say, a spelt or a rye or an AP?
Great question. So you can certainly change flours. You can train your starter essentially to thrive off of different kinds of flours. You can take part of your wheat sourdough You can take some of that out and start a rye sourdough by training it again, by feeding it rye flour. If you do want to do something like this, I would just recommend doing a sort of like introduction to that kind of flour. So rather than just, cold turkey starting on rye with your wheat sourdough, maybe feed it a little bit of rye in with your wheat flour, and then the next feeding adding more rye flour and less wheat flour, and so on until you're up to 100% rye. Of course, if you do it that way, you're never going to have a completely 100% rye starter, for sure, but you'll be pretty darn close. And it's, again, a good way to get a kickstart. You're also welcome to start your own starter that is 100% of a different kind of flour. It's sort of the same methodology that we have as rehydrating the dehydrated starter. You're just sort of skipping the step of adding that dehydrated starter and just starting out with the equal ratio feedings. It's always a process of taking some out and either using that in your recipe or keeping it as discard and adding in a new feeding. That's the sourdough way. Okay.
Oh yeah, you got it, Chloe.
Yeah. So Barbara asks, how many hours on average between last feeding and baking? How long after peak activity can you use the starter for baking? Great question. So the amount of time that the starter needs between feedings and bakings will depend a lot on three main factors. The first is temperature. So temperature of the water and the flour that you're using, temperature of the environment that it's in. Generally, higher temperatures will make the starter more active faster, and using colder temperatures will slow it down. You can use that to your advantage really well once you get a hang of it. You can also read online to figure out some better ideas of what that looks like. As I said before, generally you don't want to use water that's too hot because it can actually harm the cultures that are in there. Using temperatures that are too cold maybe can slow it down too much. That won't hurt it really, but it'll just be annoying. And let's see. So on average, I mean, if you're using let me talk about the other factors first because those do matter. The second factor is how frequently you are feeding your starter. So more frequent feedings will generally mean that your starter will be getting active faster. Sometimes you see people who have starters that they feed 3 times a day in bakeries. Most home bakers just feed their starter once a day, mostly for convenience sake. Sometimes in the winter, you can even get away with feeding every other day from just leaving your starter on the counter. And the last factor that I wanted to mention was the kind of flour that you're using. So if you decide to use rye flour, for example, that's going to be more active quicker than a wheat flour would be. If you're using whole wheat over white wheat, that also is going to be active quicker. It'll reach its peak, so to speak. And by peak, we mean that when the starter is active, it starts to build, and it gets to a certain point where it's at its fullest rise. That's what we call peak. That's when ideally you would want to use it for most recipes. You can also use it when it's before that or after that, and that's called using it when it's young or using it when it's mature. But when you're getting started, it's a good idea to start with the peak. That's the most predictable, and that's going to be the strongest usually. So it's going to depend a little bit. It's going to depend on those 3 factors we talked about: temperature, feeding schedule, and flour. But I certainly for my own baking schedule, um, I'll often do a pretty large feeding the night before, and then the next morning we'll mix all of my doughs. I do use a whole wheat starter, so it actually reaches its peak before I use it. I use a mature starter to bake. I like to use it that way for its flavor, and also because, again, convenience. um, it's something you can play around with, though. It is going to affect the properties of your final bread, and some recipes might even specify to use a young starter or to use a mature starter. And you can always look that up, but you can also just experiment and play.
Does anyone else have any other questions on, rehydrating the starter, but also starter maintenance? Anything like that for Chloe?
And I can also, I mean, it may be included in the resources, but you can always email me there at crustworthy.pgh@gmail.com if you have starter questions. I'd be happy to answer your questions. They sometimes come up when you're actually starting to bake.
Yeah. And so I guess, we're going to send out some resources that, has a lot of this information in it. How to, a list of steps that Chloe has written out of how to start your own starter and feeding schedules and all of that. I believe there are some recipes as well for mostly, and I think in those resources, it's everything but bread, right? So it's like a lot of resources on what to do with your sourdough starter discard. That seems to be in all of the workshops that we've done. That's always a big question, right? Because and like in pandemic times when flour was so scarce on the shelves, people didn't want to be dumping it down the drain, right? So there's a ton of great recipes that Chloe provided that everyone will get their hands on, things like cookies and pancakes and other delicious things. But Chloe, do you want to share maybe a couple resources of places that might have good like bread recipes or bread resources for people? Because I know sourdough bread is a whole different beast after you learn how to maintain and keep your starter healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say it right up front. If once you do start baking sourdough bread, be prepared. Uh, be prepared to maybe not meet the highest expectations. Be prepared to eat a lot of bad bread. It's still going to be good. It's still going to taste good, most likely. It takes a while to get the hang of it generally, unless you have a really scientific mind, which I don't. I'm much more feel-based and much more about learning as I do. Um, but I'm happy to share some resources that I got started out with and that I still reference along the way. Some of you may have already explored books like Tartine by Chad Robertson. That's a really big name in the sourdough world. It's a big like West Coast thing, which of course sourdough has some roots there. There's also Ken Forkish, who has a book called Flour, Water, Salt, Yeast. It's a great beginning resource. I love personally Sarah Owens. She has some great sourdough books and lots of uses for sourdough discard. I love her approach to sourdough baking. It's a little bit more loosey-goosey, which is the way that I tend to swing as well. Bonnie O'Hara also has a great bread baking for beginners book. That's literally the name of it, Bread Baking for Beginners. As far as online resources go, there's a website called The Perfect Loaf, and that is a great place to find some recipes with really scientific breakdowns. If you're interested in learning things about like what's called like baker's ratios and to get really scientific about the temperatures and timing and everything with that, that's really fun. There's also actually an online, what's the word? Like forum called the Fresh Loaf. You can create an account there and you can share recipes with other people, see other people's trials and errors. It's a great place for like asking questions to other breadheads and figuring out, what to do. Great place for inspiration. People are doing some really fun, creative things there. And it's a lot of home bakers, but there's also a lot of professionals there I see that use it. Honestly, if you feel comfortable with using the library's resources right now, I highly recommend it. There are so many sourdough books there. All you have to do is type in sourdough and a million books will come up. I'm certainly excited to have the libraries open again. And I think they're doing a pretty good job of quarantining books and having safe practices in place. So only what you're comfortable with, but I do recommend that. Oh, another one that's really fun that just came out. Brian Ford just came out with a really great sourdough book. And that one has some really different kinds of recipes in it from his own background. I'm trying to remember. Filipino? No, I
Cuban,
can't remember.
maybe.
Definitely Cuban roots in there. I remember it
I
was a
just
mix
got
of
my
two
book
things.
this week. I haven't had a chance to open it yet, but it's amazing. And he has an Instagram called, his handle is Artisan Brian,
Yes.
and it's great. Honduran.
Honduran, thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you,
and New
really.
Orleans.
Yeah,
Yep.
he's great.
Yeah. Honestly, Instagram is a huge place for sourdough, especially right now. Some of you may have already discovered that. Um, yeah, it might be hard to track down a copy from him, but he's also really generous with his, he has a website where he shares a lot of recipes. So you can always check that out. I think he even has videos on his Instagram.
His website has been a great resource for me as kind of like a beginner home baker for a lot of things. So I would definitely recommend a lot of the recipes that he put up just for free. Yeah, he's very gracious with that.
Yeah, does anyone else have any other questions on sourdough care or?
Chloe, I'm gonna make you talk about sourdough, naming your sourdough starter.
Oh yeah, how could I forget?
And please share with us your current name of your, I'm not sure if it was always the same or if.
Yeah, it's still the same. So I do like to recommend to people who are just starting out with sourdough to name your starter. I think it just helps build a personal connection to your baking and to help you remember to feed your starter. It really will become kind of like a little pet. It's alive. It's a culture of microbes that are working to give you delicious bread every time. So my starter has been with me for, I don't know, 4 years now, maybe. And now my starter's with you. But it's going to be a little different whenever you get going. Starters, uh, you know, they change over time according to their environment, according to what you're feeding it. The microbes may not always be the same. But my starter's name is David Dowie, and I'm happy to share him with you. David is a great friend, a nice little collection of microscopic beings. I also have a rye starter that was born from David. I named the rye starter Mariah Carey, and just to keep with that theme. But you are welcome to, uh, name your starter whatever. It doesn't have to be a pun. It doesn't have to be the way that I did it. I've seen some really good names over my scrounging on the internet. Also a really fun activity with kids if you're interested in getting your kid involved and allowing them to name the starter.
Thanks, Chloe. I think it also helps if you have roommates or other family members to uh, put the name on the jar so they know that it's not trash.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah,
Especially if you're keeping your starter in the fridge and you're keeping discard in there to keep them separate and labeled. Yeah, it's important to build respect for the starter, and a name helps.
absolutely. Great. Well, we will be sending out the resources that we talked about probably tomorrow, along with this recorded video. So you can always rewatch this and reference any of the great things that Chloe said tonight. But also the resources should help, organize some of those thoughts for you as well. We hope you guys are enjoying your grain boxes, and it's been so fun to put this together and to kind of share all of the amazing resources that our region has just kind of right here within itself. And we were so happy that there was so much interest for a box like this. And, also so happy to be able to feature Chloe and other businesses that are like working so hard to keep this region fed with local, whole, delicious grains. And we really appreciate all of your support and interest in that project. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Chloe or to Craft. We'd be happy to answer any questions about the grain boxes more generally. And thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, everyone.
Yay. Oh, great, Alice. I'm excited for you to start baking too. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you, everyone, and happy baking.
Happy baking. All right. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks, Chloe.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.